We're going to make an Angel Jewels quilt, and you need to start off with 1 3/4 inch strips. These strips should be contrasting colors or light and dark. They're going to be put together, right sides together, with a 1/4 inch seam. Once you've sewn them together, you're going to press them open with the seam to one side. Like, I always press towards the dark side. I did my 1/4 inch seam, I pressed it to one side. I'm going to chop these 1 3/4 inch strips into 1 3/4 inch sections. So I look at my ruler, I got 1 3/4 inches. So you need 2 of these little sections that are 1 3/4 inches. So I'm going to do 2 of them. So I take my 2 little pieces, and I'm going to put them so that they're opposite like a checkerboard, and I'm going to put them right sides together. And you'll notice that when you're matching up the seam, you've got your fold to one side and your fold to the other side on the back. They kind of butt right up against each other. You can feel them. They won't slip that way. And you do your 1/4 inch seam across. And when you press it open, you're going to press it so that your seam can go either one side or the other. It doesn't matter. You can also press it if you want to press it so the seam is open. It doesn't really matter on this particular one. So the corners are going to be done out of triangles. So you have squares that are 3.5 inches. And you're going to need 2 of them for each of these Angel Jewel blocks. So you take both of the squares, you're going to pre-cut them into triangles. And I do that by just going diagonally across from point to point. So you end up with 4 triangles. And you're going to work on opposite sides. So you take the first triangle, you lay it down, matching the point with the seam, and matching the raw edge with the raw edge of your little 4 square. And then you give yourself a 1/4 inch seam across this bias side. Now it's a bias and it will stretch, so you have to be careful not to pull it while you're working on that seam. And you can just start where the edge of your bottom fabric is. Now I do the opposite side as well before I do any pressing. So I open that out. I take another one of these triangles on the opposite edge. I'm going to match the raw edge. I'm going to match the point. I'm going to stitch it. Now when you open it out, you can press it open, and when you press it open, you're going to want to press it towards the triangles. If they're dark, in this case they're light, so I'm going to force it to press in so that you don't see it behind the triangles. Press them in towards the colors, and that's what we end up with. Now we need to work on the opposite sides again. So we lay down our fabric right sides together. We match up our point and our raw edges. And you can see it's all crazy with points sticking out. Don't worry about it. Just stitch your 1/4 inch seam all the way across everything. Right where the V is. Right where the point meets the side. That's actually your 1/4 inch mark if you were to measure that. And again, I'll work on the opposite corner. So I push this out away. I'm going to take my last triangle, and I'm going to match the point along the seam in the middle there. press the whole thing open, and then we're ready to sandwich it and quilt. So here it is pressed. And you can see this point sticking out everywhere. Don't worry about the points. They'll all get trimmed off later. We use a 5-inch block for the back of the quilt piece. So we'll put that with the wrong side up, the right side down. And we use our 5-inch batting. And then we lay down our quilt block. You see how nicely it fits. And now what we're going to do is just quilt by stitching in the ditch right along that seam line. If you want to see your quilting, you can choose to stitch outside of it on your triangles. It's up to you. I like to stitch in the ditch. Now when I stitch in the ditch, it's actually best not to start at a corner. It's actually best to start on a straight edge. So I'm going to start on the straight. And now I can bring my stitches up to a normal size again, instead of being really tiny. The key to stitching in the ditch is trying to stay really close, at least close to the edge. And when I get close to the point, to the corner, I hand crank, I put my needle in, I lift my foot, and I pivot it, put the foot back down, and then I continue to. And I'm going to hand crank it till I get to the point I want to pivot it. I lift up my foot and I pivot it. Just back stitch a couple times and then trim it. So that's one angel jewel block. The back has a simple square on it. Okay, now that we have our block done, we have to square it off. All of our blocks are 4.5 inches square. This ruler is a 4.5 inch square ruler, and it's made specifically to make these little squares. The middle of it has a grid, so that'll fit perfectly on the points in the middle of your squares. So you can know that from that point on, everything's lined up. We match our points. We match along a seam line, everything's matched up. You hold your ruler down and you're going to cut on all 4 sides of the ruler to take off those extra little pieces that were all over the place. You can pick it up and spin it, and now you know you're going to line up on that edge still. Press down nice and hard because you're going through all the layers of the batting and fabric, so you want to make sure you hold the ruler down nice and firm so it doesn't shift, and you want to make sure that you're pressing your blade nice and hard so you go through all layers. So now you end up with a perfect block that matches your other blocks. So to put them together, we need to use binding. We're going to use binding that is 1 3/4 inches wide on the back. These are cut in strips, salvage to salvage, across your fabric. They're measured at 1 3/4 inches. You fold them in half and you press them. You're going to line them up underneath your block so that the raw edges are even with the raw edges, and the fold is loose on the back. Then the top sashing is cut at 1 1/8 inch. You don't have to fold it or press it. It's just left flat with raw edges on both sides. You're going to line that up also. So now you have a sandwich with your sashing that's flat on the top, with your quilt block in the middle, and your sashing that's folded on the back. You're going to sew it with a 1/4 inch seam. When you get to the end, you're going to trim off the extra and use it on your next block. So I just trim it through all the layers. So I'm going to use the extra on the next block. I can trim this nice and flat. I'm taking the salvage off because you don't want to use the salvage ever. So you end up with a block that has sashing on one edge. You're not going to do this all the way around. You're just going to do it on one edge. You can collect these in a bucket, lots of them. And when you're ready to put them together, it's already got sashing on it. Every one of them will have sashing on one edge, so that when you put them together, you're always left with sashing on the last piece in the row. So now 2 of these are going to go together in this way. You make sure you have the flat sashing on the top. This one's going to go right here, so I'm going to put it right sides together. I'm going to make sure it's kind of squared off all the way around, and I'm going to sew the sashing to the block, and I'm going to leave the quilt block and the other sashing floating. So in order to do that, I flip it over in this way so I can see what I'm doing when I sew my 1/4 inch seam. You can see that your batting from both blocks kind of just matches up really nicely. And this binding, which is really sashing, folds over and it covers the seam that you just did. You can see my white stitching for the seam that I just made. And this is where you're going to blind stitch the sashing in place to the back. And you're going to, this one's already been blind stitched. So I'll show you how to blind stitch. So I take my needle and I'm going to put it into my sashing that has the fold. So I'm starting in the fold. I come out so my knot will be hid inside that fold. And I'm going to place my sashing over my bottom fabric. I'm going to take a stitch in the bottom fabric. It can be a nice big stitch. You don't have to worry about little tiny stitches when you do a blind stitch. What you have to worry about is where you're going to go in. It has to be directly across from where you came out of your fabric on the quilt block. You have to go into your fold exactly across from it and take another stitch. Same thing, now that I've come out of the fold, I've got to go into my quilt block exactly across from where I came out of my fold. That's how you do a proper blind stitch. And I can do this better if I actually hold it up. You can see you get across it pretty quickly, and this is also how you sew the binding on the outside edges of your quilt with a nice blind stitch. When you get enough of these together in one row, you can start a second row and a third row. So use your scraps up, make these little angel blocks, keep them in a bucket, and then when you feel like putting a bunch of rows together, you can sew them all together on the fronts, and then sit down, relax, and do your hand stitching on the back whenever you want. Like, you don't have to do them just one at a time. I don't normally hand stitch one block at a time. I wait till I have several to do. When you get your rows long enough and you want to put your rows together, you put them together in the same way. You add one long piece of sashing across all of your blocks on the front and back the same way, and you put the row together in the same way. So now I'm at the end of my block. I just take a stitch and a second stitch. When I do the third one, I go back through the loop, and that makes a knot. And there's the beginning of a row.